Tunnels of light, a feeling of leaving your body, an overwhelming sense of peace or sometimes fear. For centuries, people have described these moments during brushes with death. But what if these experiences weren't just supernatural, but neurochemical? Find out how in this week's episodes of The Neuro Nerd. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, were first formally described in 1892 by geologist Albert Heim after he fell while climbing and experienced time-slowing and serene visions. But it wasn't until 1975 that the term entered popular science thanks to Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, which compiled more than 150 ICU patient stories involving bright tunnels, lights, and out-of-body sensations. Since then, theories have tried to explain NDEs through psychology, neuroscience, and even evolution. In 2001, a Lancet study by Van Lommel et al. Marked the first major prospective clinical investigation into NDEs. Later, researchers like Carl Jensen proposed ketamine-based theories, while others pointed to REM intrusion, dissociation, and evolutionary survival strategies. A new review fresh off the press in March of this year by Charlotte Marshall and colleagues published in Nature Reviews Neurology integrates decades of fragmented findings into a single cohesive model called Neptune, or the Neurophysiological Evolutionary Psychological Theory Understanding Near-Death Experiences. That's a mouthful. This model suggests that NDEs emerge from a cascading chain of neurochemical and psychological events, beginning with brain stress and culminating in vivid conscious experiences. They argue that first, a drop in oxygen and blood pressure leads to hypoxia, which is just a fancy term for without oxygen. And that then causes ATP deletion, which then impairs neurotransmitters like the serotonin transporter 5-HTT, dopamine transporter, and noradrenaline transporters. We see an increase in these neurotransmitters, particularly the 5-HT receptors, which often have this calming effect, and specifically the 5-HT2A receptor is commonly associated with hallucinogenic experiences. So this 5-HT2A activation, especially in the visual cortex and default mode network, which is the network we often associate with our baseline functioning, where we're not really engaged in a particular task, for example, this is strongly linked to what we call mystical experiences. The authors also mention acetylcholine in the central nervous system, which is known for its role in learning and memory formation, quote, by strengthening synaptic connections through long-term potentiation, meaning that even in low-energy states, memory encoding may still occur, and that could explain why these moments are so unforgettable to the people experiencing them. This paper also alludes to potential personality differences between folks who report NDEs and those who don't. For example, they mention research by Grayson and colleagues who suggest that people with greater propensity to experience non-pathological dissociation like daydreaming or fantasy states may be at a heightened risk of experiencing these NDEs. In an opinion piece by Christoph Koch, he raises a point that NDEs occur across cultures in all people, young and old, devout or skeptic. He cites the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Christian Bible, and 19th century Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky as evidence. He also notes the similarities between NDEs and epilepsy, stating, quote, these seizures partially impair consciousness and often are localized to specific brain regions in one hemisphere. They can be preceded by an aura. The seizure may be accompanied by changes in the perceived sizes of objects, unusual tastes, smells, or bodily feelings, déjà vu, depersonalization, or ecstatic feelings. And for those interested in déjà vu, consider checking out my video essay on the neuroscience behind it. Okay, shameless plug over. He goes on to say that we are now able to induce these feelings by stimulating the cortex, specifically the insula, in epileptic patients who have electrodes implanted, and may cause out-of-body experiences and similar hallucinations that are characterized by NDEs. The insula is a really crucial part of the brain located in the lateral sulcus. It's commonly associated with sensory processing and interoception, which I think makes total sense to this author's claim. But as much as I agree with these points, I do want to take a moment to point out a very small but important critique. Often in neuroscience research, you'll notice that we often go back to epilepsy and epileptic patients, and the most common question I get is why? In fact, if you've been watching my videos, you'll notice that I've mentioned neuroscientific literature on epilepsy in nearly every single video essay I've published, and the answer is surprisingly simple and a huge limitation in our field currently. Put simply, epileptic patients are some of the rare few who actively undergo direct electrode implantation of the brain, often for short periods in clinical settings, and it's mostly just so that the doctors can detect in the brain where the seizures are occurring. Because we can't implant electrodes in voluntary research, it offers a super unique and rare opportunity to understand the brain at this level of precision, and some researchers are lucky enough to run super short experiments during this implantation period. But my biggest critique of basing our current knowledge and field on these few rare patients is that it's a limitation of what the general populace looks like. It's nearly impossible to tell whether or not the brain of someone with epilepsy has exactly the same neurochemical, structural, or functional properties as somebody without, and post-mortem studies can only tell us so much about these differences. So even though I agree with these points, I do think we need to be careful about relating a common population-level phenomenon such as NDEs with something as specific and pathologized as epilepsy, for example. Going back to Marshall's Neptune model, we also see this nod to evolutionary theory, and the authors argue that NDEs could potentially offer evolutionary advantages by increasing adaptation to the environment through dissociation, which then helps folks cope with these life-threatening situations. And I really like the thought of this theory, but I think there are some key issues with it. For one, it doesn't necessarily make sense to experience an NDE if you've already are at the point of actively dying. At that point, the body and the mind are coming to terms with end of life, not readapting to the environment. And their main point is that the NDEs help enhance coping skills, but what would be the advantage of coping if the body is actively dying? If the body is in irreversible failure, what's the point of coping at all? Coping mechanisms make sense if there's a chance to recover, to hide, to stay calm, to survive, but in the face of actual death, like prolonged cardiac arrest, for example, it's really unclear how these rich experiences would offer any evolutionary advantage. By then, the brain isn't adapting to help us act. Instead, I propose that we may actually be seeing a final integrative reward signal, or, for example, like a neurochemical release that offers emotional closure and reinforced meaning at somebody's life's end. And from this perspective, I'd be curious to know if there's any literature on ventral tegmental areas and its projections to the accumbens or the PFC in reward prediction for NDE-like experiences. Going back to those epilepsy studies, for example, it would be really interesting to go in and stimulate the insula and take a look at these NDE-like experiences and also check, ventral tegmental area, check out whether or not reward prediction or reward processing, if these systems are also enacted during these experiences. I think what fascinates me the most about near-death experiences is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in it, but there's also a lot of similarities across people. Like, out of all the symptoms, everybody's always reporting bright lights, or they're reporting that they see a tunnel, or they're flashing back to their memories. But then other people, they report very specific imagery and experiences, different sights, sounds, and smells that were really important to them in their life. And I think that's really beautiful. For those that don't know, I am a Christian, and so I'm able to sort of mix both of these worlds, where I think that there is this deeper philosophical and spiritual meaning behind these NDEs, but I also think that there are a lot of overlapping concepts and constructs within neuroscience that help explain some of these experiences. And in the end, what we call a near-death experience is still not fully understood in neuroscience, and we have a lot of research left to do in this area. So whether it's shaped by biology, culture, or something we don't yet understand, these NDEs remind us that the boundaries between mind, meaning, and mortality are more fluid than we think. That's it. That's all I've got for today, guys, and thanks so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.